Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. I do hope you're doing great. I'm doing very well, and what an exciting story we're listening to right now about the abduction of Mrs. Roxburgh. So let's see what's going to happen next. But before we do, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and feel free to share these stories with anybody who enjoys a good story. So let's get started. It was a beautiful summer's day, the sun dancing merrily through the trees, spilling its light prisms through the branches, and dappling the forest floor in an ethereal glittery glaze, which made everything glow to a certain extent. Some of the green plants were covered with silvery droplets of water that had been left behind from the recent rainfall. Bees and butterflies seemed to happily frolic over the woodland flowers. Birds tweeted high up in the canopy of the trees, while a couple of white-tailed deer skittered away nervously when they saw Elk. Elk wasn't happy to be bringing this pretty lady to live at their house, locked up in the ensuite bedroom, rather like a caged animal. He knew it wasn't right, but what could he do? It was more than his life was worth to go against his sister's demanding biddings. Sometimes he wished he could live on his own, without Gladys interfering in his life and laying unnecessary demands on him that made no sense to him at all. Gladys was always telling him how much he needed her, but did he really? Yes, his sister was decidedly clever, so if she said he needed her, then he obviously did. But Elk independently made his own money, and with his carved ornaments that he sold to the curio shop in town, that were in high demand, especially the wooden key rings that he created of woodland animals, with the name of the state of Georgia engraved on them. People loved to buy those as mementos, and recently he'd been carving key rings with peaches on them as well, and those were selling like hotcakes, as peaches were the state's revered fruit. Elk did all the cooking and cleaning in the house for his sister Gladys, who liked everything to always be spick and span. He regularly bought food items at the local store, from lists that Gladys would prepare for him. She would get decidedly angry with Elk if he overlooked an item on his shopping list. Elk drove an old beaten-down truck that had once belonged to his father, but it still worked rather well, even though it made a rather unfortunate clattering sound. Why did he need his sister? He didn't know the answer to the question. As Elk was casually sauntering down the beaten track, with the woman in his arms, he was very glad she wasn't awake. Elk wouldn't know what to say if she was awake, as his social skills were sorely lacking, and how could he explain to her that he was bringing her back to live at their home? He knew the pretty lady would not be happy about this. Elk could hear the sound of heavy feet thumping towards him, as twigs crackled and leaves were crushed, while the ground vibrated under the ponderous footfall that seemed to charge towards him. Elk was familiar with the man coming his way, whom he considered a very good friend. All the animals in the woods respected the hairy man. The birds would stop tweeting, and everything would become respectively silent when he was around, as if in some way they knew it was only polite to be quiet, like the pupils in the school that became very silent when the headmistress starts to walk on the podium to address her audience. Elk knew his hairy friend was the keeper of the forest. He watched over everything with a shrewd, discerning eye, and was always quick to sense when something was amiss, rather like a snake can easily detect its prey on the wind. The hairy man's name was Umuna, and Elk liked him, as Umuna understood him, in the way that regular folk did not. People looked on Elk as one of society's misfits, due to his learning difficulties, as his brain was obviously wired differently to other folk. But Umuna never looked on him as stupid, but on the contrary seemed to acknowledge him and respect him, and no one had ever treated Elk like that before. The hairy man lived in these woods, and had done so for many years. Elk knew he walked over vast distances. He never wore clothes, as his whole body was covered in long flowing dark hair, but his body temperature always remained regulated in both summer and winter. He was adapted to living in the wild, and Elk knew if the hairy man wanted to become invisible, he could do so, just like that. Elk marvelled that he had this ability to just camouflage himself to his surroundings so that no one would see him, like some fish in the ocean managed to do. Umuna was incredibly strong, He had a powerful, robust body, and even in his presence, a large man like Elk felt conspicuously small by contrast. Elk had never asked Umuna how old he was. That would have been a rude thing to do. But Umuna seemed to read his thoughts, because he'd answered Elk once in his head and said, "I'm old enough. That's all you need to know." And that had been enough for Elk. The hairy man stood in the footpath, looking at Elk. There were 2 dead rabbits dangling in both of his hands. He had promised Elk 2 rabbits that morning. Rabbits were delicious in stew. They tasted exactly like chicken. Elk always made stew for his sister Gladys. She believed it was chicken she was eating, but he never told her she was actually eating rabbit. If he'd done so, she'd probably have had a hernia on the spot. But Umuna had assured him that rabbits were excellent food. Elk enjoyed doing business with Umuna. He'd give the hairy man crunchy peanut butter, granola bars, raisin and oatmeal cookies, and honey, in swift exchange for quality meat or fish that Umuna caught. The hairy man stopped dead in his tracks when he realized that Elk was carrying a woman in his arms. His treacle-coloured eyes grew round in surprise, as if he thought his eyes were deceiving him. Umuna was obviously wondering what Elk was doing carrying a woman in his arms like this. Ostensibly, to any casual observer, it probably wasn't a very good look. Far from it, in fact. Anyone might believe there was something dreadfully wrong with the pretty woman. Her eyes were closed shut, but with the gentle rise and fall of her chest, it was easy to observe that she was still breathing. Umuna looked concerned and rather troubled as he trotted over to Elk, with his normal confident swagger. He cast a disquieted gaze over the woman that Elk was carrying in his arms. Umuna's large hand touched Mrs. Roxburgh's forehead, as if he was touching her to observe her temperature. He grunted something under his breath, and then Elk heard the words in his head, "She's fast asleep. Why are you carrying her in your arms? She doesn't look sick to me, but she's out for the count. Dead to the world, it would seem." "My sister wants me to bring her here to live with us," Elk explained. "My sister made me poke her arm with an injection, so she fell asleep. She wants me to take her to the bedroom and lock her away in there for a long time. She told me to bring her to the house. I'm not happy about any of this, but my sister gets upset if I don't obey her. She gets angry at times. She scares me a lot." Umuna looked baffled and rather bemused. He scratched his head as if he was deep in thought, puzzling over a strange conundrum that he needed to resolve. "But why does she want you to do that?" he asked. "I don't know. My sister made me bring her here. She wants to keep her in a room locked up like a bird, in a cage. My sister is strange, Umuna. I've never understood her." Umuna was not impressed with Elk's revelation. He knew at once that something was decidedly off, and the woman had been taken to Elk's sister's house against her will. "I know who she is," he said. "She lives at the big white house at the bottom of the road. I've seen her many times before, when she takes her dog for a walk in the woods. She never sees me, of course. I make sure of that, because I'm in my invisible mode. But it's not right, you know, bringing her here against her will. You do know that." "I have to do it," Elk informed Umuna. "If I don't do what Gladys wants me to do, she'll be mad. Once she was so cross with me she locked me up in the closet for 2 whole days, without food and water. It was cramped and dark in there. I could barely breathe." Umuna nodded, as if he understood Elk's plight. He did look troubled, though, about the woman that Elk was carrying in his arms, as if in some way he wanted to help her. Umuna put the rabbits on the branch. "For you," he said to Elk. Elk nodded. He watched the hairy man gliding away. After Elk had placed the sleeping woman on the bed in the spare bedroom that his sister had planned for their prisoner to occupy, he then remembered what else his sister had ordered him to do. So he obediently returned to the large house at the bottom of the road, where the Roxburghs lived. The front door was still half open, and Mrs. Roxburgh's car keys were sitting on the desk in the hallway, where his sister Gladys told him he'd likely find them. "If you see a purse on the table, I want you to bring it back as well, Elk, so people will assume that she left her house on her own accord. That's what I want them to think. Elk found the purse next to the keys and drove the car back to his sister's place, as she'd instructed him to do. It's very important, Elk, that you make the car look like a pile of compost. How am I supposed to do that? He'd asked Gladys. You need to cover it with twigs and bark, of course, and all kinds of plant material, she had insisted. And he'd done just that, so that Mrs. Roxburgh's car resembled a huge pile of compost. Ashley Roxburgh. It had been several days, insufferable days at that, where I'd been living in a bedroom en suite in Gladys Mackenzie's house of all things. Why the woman had brought me here I couldn't fathom, but her motives were highly nefarious. If my husband Simon had an inkling of what she'd done to me, he'd be livid. He'd literally wring that woman's neck in a heartbeat. She must be completely deranged, I thought. She was harmless enough when she was tutoring my son, but I could see she was anything but. My poor family must be so worried about my whereabouts, wondering what has become of me. My husband and children will be distressed to see I'm not at home. And yet my car remains in the carport and my purse and keys on the desk in the hallway. So they're not going to make any sense of my disappearance at all. Why would I leave the house without my car and my keys? Surely this will make my family realize that something is up. I can see Miss Mackenzie has got Elk to do all her dirty work for her. She was the reason why he injected me with a sedative, so that I was easily brought back to the house in his arms fast asleep. I figured out that had happened when Elk suddenly stabbed me with a needle, and everything went completely black. I don't remember anything after that. I do recall the needle being stabbed into my arms and suddenly feeling dizzy, but then everything just disappears from my recall. I don't think the poor man wanted to do any of this to me, but Miss Mackenzie pretty much rules the roost around here, with a formidable grip. That has become painfully apparent to me. I've been locked up in this bedroom for several days now. I soon learnt there was no way of escape. There are bars on the windows and the bedroom door, designed to keep me safely locked away. Whenever Gladys enters my bedroom, she always insists that Elk is by her side. Elk always looks incredibly uncomfortable, rather like a deer caught in headlights. She carries a Glock pistol in her hands when she visits me, which she points at me warningly. She says if I do anything stupid, she won't hesitate to blow my brains out. I believe her on this. She's not right in the head. Miss Mackenzie gets her brother Elk to bring me steaming hot food on trays, which he lays down for me. Then she insists that he removes all my dirty dishes. I feel sorry for Elk. He's the only hope I have in getting out of my prison. I need to work on him in some way, to get him on side, and to help him see that what his sister has done is terribly wrong. I can see he does give me apologetic looks, as if he's trying to tell me that none of this is his choosing. I believe that is true. I know he doesn't enjoy my being in their house, any more than I enjoy being a prisoner here, but at least I have food in my belly, toilet facilities available to me, clean clothes and hot water, as well as books to read. So I'm a lot better off than some people who've been abducted. I try to tell myself this all the time, when I begin to feel sorry for myself. I knew it was more than my life was worth to wrestle with the likes of Miss Mackenzie. She is stark raving mad, rather like Kathy Bates in that Stephen King novel called Misery. I remember watching that movie a while back, and believing that no one in real life could be that unhinged. But let me tell you, they can, because Miss Mackenzie is literally the doppelganger for that woman. I'm not exaggerating when I say that. Miss Mackenzie wants me here, and if she has to end up breaking my legs to keep me immobilized, like Kathy Bates did with her victim, she'd surely do it. I wouldn't put anything past that woman. I'm sorry to say this, she's downright evil. My son Howard would tell me as much about her, but I simply refused to listen. I believed he was a belligerent teenager making a fuss about having to do some extra studies. Now I know he was speaking the absolute truth. In the beginning I did not comprehend why Miss Mackenzie brought me here in the first place, but I was soon to find out what her ulterior motives actually were, and they threw me a loop, let me tell you. I don't know why it took me so long to cotton on. Why are you doing this to me, Gladys? Why did you bring me here? Why are you keeping me a prisoner? What have I ever done to you? I asked her. It's not personal, Mrs. Roxburgh. It just is what it is. Please let me go, Miss Mackenzie. I won't tell anyone you brought me here. It'll be our little secret. Miss Mackenzie did not dignify my questions with a response. I knew I could have screamed, banged on the walls, kicked up a major fuss. But no one would have heard me anyway. Besides, I needed my wits to devise a cunning plan to escape my current confinement, and falling apart at the seams would never get me very far. It was when Gladys came into the room a day later with her Glock gun pointed at me, when she demanded I write a letter to my husband in my own handwriting. I understood what was going on. The letter read, Sweetheart, I'm sorry to leave you so abruptly, but I need plenty of time to think. I'm going away for a while. I'm not sure if I will ever return. Please don't try and find me. There really is no point. I'm happier on my own. Take good care of the kids. Why are you making me write a letter like this? Gladys I'd asked. I don't understand. You're not going to kill me, are you? Bury me in your yard? Make me suddenly disappear? For goodness sake, Gladys, be reasonable. Why are you doing these insane things? This is absolutely ridiculous. You've gone too far. Me and my husband, we love each other. He won't believe this letter if he reads it for a single second. I'm sure he will believe it was written under duress. He knows we don't have marital problems. He knows I'm very happy in our current relationship. So writing an absurd letter like this won't make any sense to him at all. That's where you're wrong, my dear. He will believe the letter, said Miss Mackenzie, looking smugly satisfied, as she took the finished letter away from me. Her cold dark eyes glinted with malice. I'll make sure he believes every single word of it. Don't you worry. I have no intention of killing you. What's the point? I'm a reasonable person, after all. I'd never stoop as low as to murder anyone. That would be so vulgar. Besides, I don't need to do that. I will keep you here for as long as it is needed, until your husband Simon finally realizes it's me he loves and not you. When you're no longer around, your husband will become incredibly lonely. You know what men are like. He'll need lots of comforting and reassurance. He'll need his bed nicely warmed, won't he? And I'll be there for him, Mrs. Roxburgh, when you aren't. I'm quite sure once I've turned on my charms, he won't be able to resist me. I knew from the moment I met your husband that he was meant to be mine. We are soulmates, destined to be together forever. And you, Mrs. Roxburgh, you're just in the way. That's all. It was in that poignant moment I did really realize what was going on here. Miss Mackenzie was in love with my husband, and would stop at nothing to get her grubby hands on him. I was obviously in the way of her endeavours, which was why she'd brought me here. She claimed she had no intention of killing me. Could I believe her on that? I wasn't sure I could trust her. The woman was fanatical. Fanatics are exceedingly dangerous. Everything suddenly made perfect sense to me. It had been all over town that Gladys Mackenzie had a love interest, for she had undergone an extraordinary metamorphosis of late that everybody was talking about. In a small town, people tend to gossip a lot. Little did I realize her love interest was my own husband. My daughter Victoria was very vocal regarding the matter of her math teacher, Miss Mackenzie. I'm telling you, Mum, that woman is dressing so differently these days. I can hardly believe it. She used to dress like a nun in a convent. Everything she wore was so sensible and dull, and she used to wear these disgusting brogues on her feet. I think the only colours in her wardrobe were grey and brown. I mean, really drab stuff. She always wore that big ugly black braid of hers. It was so long it almost touched her bum, and her hair was pulled away from her face, which made her look more hard, you know. It did nothing to soften her sharp features, or that beak-like nose of hers. When she came to school with her hair all pretty with auburn highlights, and she was wearing lipstick, it made her eyes stand out. I was in shock, let me tell you. I barely recognised the woman, Mum. Everyone gasped when she entered our classroom to teach math. She was dolled up to the nines as if she'd stepped out of a bandbox. People began to giggle. The boys were giving her wolf whistles and saying, "Miss Mackenzie, is that you?" Goodness gracious, you kids can be mean. I'm glad I'm not a teacher by profession, I said. The giggling and wolf whistling is a bit nasty, is it not? Give the poor woman a break. Good for her, I say. If she's met someone, then I'm very happy for her. She's been terribly sweet coming here to give Howard extra math lessons. Not many teachers would do that. I will admit these days she is dressing nice. But what's wrong with that? Having a sense of self-esteem. Trying to reinvent yourself. I say good on her. What do you think about all this? I asked my son Howard. I hate Miss Mackenzie. She's an absolute cow. She may think she looks pretty these days with her brand new wardrobe and fancy hairstyle, but you can't make a silk purse out of a sow's ear, can you? It's so embarrassing, her coming all the time to teach me math at our house. She makes out to Dad that I'm so terrible at math, that I'm lagging behind all the other pupils in class. But she's exaggerating, Mum. Look, Howard, I think the reason Miss Mackenzie comes over to give you math lessons is because she knows that you're a perfectly capable pupil and that you're able to do the math, that you're a clever young man. But your big problem is that when you don't want to do something, you don't apply yourself. Well, I will apply myself now, Mum. I really will. If that little hag goes away and leaves me alone and doesn't teach me math, I don't like her being around. And you should see how she is with Dad. It's pathetic. What do you mean, how she is with your father? Nothing, said Howie. Forget I said anything. Howard, when my mother vanished mysteriously from our lives, as you can imagine, my family didn't take it at all well, least of all my father Simon. It was so uncharacteristic of my mother to bugger off like that. It made absolutely no sense at all. But her car and purse were missing from our house, although she did leave the front door wide open and failed to lock up behind her on the day she chose to vanish from our lives. We knew she would never willingly just abandon us like this. My father reported her missing to the police, but they didn't do anything for the first 24 hours, especially as her car and purse were missing, which suggested that she had chosen to leave us on her own accord. A day later my father found a letter in a plain envelope, tucked under the front door mat, explaining my mother's sudden, inexplicit departure from our lives, which once again made no sense to us at all. My father was not sure how long the letter had been lying under the mat for. In the letter my mother enigmatically expressed that she needed her space, and we were not to try and find her. When the police read my mother's letter, they were very nonchalant about everything, as you would expect them to be. They simply told my father that a search would not be necessary. My mother had chosen to go off on her own accord, which she was perfectly entitled to do so as an adult. I don't understand, my father said. You've got to believe me, officer. My wife just wouldn't saunter off like this, nor leave a note. If we have issues in our relationship, we talk about them. Besides anything else, my wife would never leave the kids without saying goodbye first. Was your wife suffering from depression, Mr. Roxburgh? My father was asked. Absolutely not. Well, not to my knowledge, that is. Were you having marital issues, perhaps? I've just told you, officer, no to all the above. We were both very happy in our marriage, very happy indeed. We really love each other. We are always going on about how lucky we are to have each other. I think I would know if my wife was feeling miserable in my marriage. Look, Mr. Roxburgh, the letter you say is written in your wife's handwriting. You found it yourself under your front door mat, did you not? Yes, it is her handwriting, officer, but the message is so vague. My wife wouldn't write a letter like this. My wife is extremely articulate. She'd never just bugger off like this, officer. It's most unlike her. I think something nefarious is going on. You have to believe me on this. I know this is not easy to hear, Mr. Roxburgh, but people, I'm afraid, in my experience, are much more complicated than we imagine they are. We might think we know them better than we do. We might think we know what is going on in their heads. But sometimes when people are going through stuff, they keep it to themselves. Your wife has said very clearly in the letter that she needs her space.
My advice to you is to give her plenty of time. I'm sure when she's had a little break from home, she will return in due course. Perhaps she just got a little overwhelmed, that's all. It does happen, you know."
My father was a broken man that was seemingly falling apart at the seams, although he desperately tried to hold it together for us. He went everywhere, looking like a lost dog. He looked for my mother and asked the folks in town whether they had seen her, or if they might have a clue where she might have gone. I think my father soon rather sadly realized that he was looking for the proverbial needle in a haystack. He would never find my mother. Many of the locals were dropping over to our house with casseroles, offering words of encouragement. One of my mother's friends, called Sheila Larkspur, gave my father hope when she told him that once she'd done much the same thing as my mother.
"You mustn't worry, Simon. You really mustn't. I've gone off for a few days myself, you know, when my life got on top of me. I did much the same as your wife did. I left a note for my husband saying I needed space. It sounds very familiar to me."
My father's face lit up when he heard that.
"Don't look so surprised, Simon. Yes, I did that, and I'm not proud of myself. But things really just became so overwhelming for me. I needed to get away from it all. We were going through so much stress at the time. My husband was not remotely impressed by my leaving, of course. But I felt so down in the dumps, so dreadfully depressed. When that happens, people sometimes run away from their lives to get a sense of perspective. I know I did. When I was away, it helped me to reflect a lot, and I realized how much I missed my husband. So I returned home pretty soon, you know. I'm sure, Simon, that Ashley will be back soon herself. Maybe she's going through a rough patch like I did. She recently turned 40 after all. That can be very upsetting for some women. When I turned 40, I was absolutely devastated. I really thought it was the end of the world. All those big numbers when it comes to birthdays can be most distressing for women, you know." "So you think my wife was very upset about turning 40? Well, it's a possibility, isn't it? You mustn't overlook it." "Where did you go, Sheila, if you don't mind me asking?" my father inquired. "Well, I found a sweet little cottage by the coast, didn't I? I rented the place for an entire week. It was the best thing I actually ever did. Time to be on my own. Time to reflect. I came back feeling so re-energized. My husband was not best pleased with me, of course, but that's a whole other story. And let's just say, I would never do that again. I realized how fiercely I'd hurt the man."
I think that Mrs. Larkspur's words had given my father a renewed sense of hope. He told us that he'd been an absolute fool. He'd failed to realize that my mother was going through a tough time.
"I know she wasn't desperately happy when she turned 40. She put on a smiley face, of course. But I could see it upset her. She didn't like the big number. She was saying she felt old all of a sudden. Maybe that is what this is all about. Give your mother plenty of time, and I'm sure she will be back."
"I don't think Mum was sad when she turned 40, Dad," my sister Victoria interjected. "She seemed perfectly all right to me."
"Maybe she was hiding it from us well," my father had said, seemingly determined to believe this narrative. It helped him hang on to hope that my mother would soon be home. It was soon after my mother had gone from our lives that Miss Mackenzie, my math teacher from school, kept popping around with casseroles for my father from one day to the next. My father seemed to be blindly oblivious that Miss Mackenzie clearly had the hots for him. When she arrived at our house in her beaten-down Mazda, she looked as if she was about to go to the opera, she was so dressed up. "Oh, you poor thing, Simon," she said to my father,
batting her eyelashes at him and trying to look demure.
"I heard the dreadful news via the grapevine, that your wife has left you. I'm sure Ashley never appreciated what a good man you really are, Simon. You deserve so much better than her. I can't understand what Ashley was thinking, leaving you like that. It's nonsensical. I mean, honestly, what a dreadful thing to do. And abandoning your children like this. The mind boggles. The children need their mother. I'm sorry to say this, Simon. I'm sure you don't want to hear me say it, but Ashley has been incredibly selfish doing this to you. Look, Gladys, I'm sure you mean well. But my wife, she's not been herself recently. I'm sure she will return home in due course, once the dust settles. I think she's been a little down in the dumps recently, depressed about turning 40. But it's very kind of you, Gladys, to make us casseroles. But it's really not necessary. Oh, but it is necessary, Simon. I must insist. Everyone in town is terribly worried about you and your family. Nobody can believe Ashley walked out on you. And the children, of course. It's a dreadful thing to do, a dreadful thing. If you were my husband, Simon, I would never treat you so shoddily. Never. I'm very sorry, Gladys, but I really would prefer if you didn't talk about my wife like this. I'm just sure she's going through the dark night of the soul. It happens to all of us from time to time.
I was later to learn from my father that one day he returned home to find my math teacher, Gladys Mackenzie, lying in his king-size bed, waiting for him while she kept the sheets warm. He never told us about this, but it really rattled him at the time, as you might expect. She had put rose petals on the bed and French champagne on ice in a large tumbler on the side table. My father had no idea how she managed to get into the house, but he sneakily suspected she'd found the spare key that we kept hidden under the terracotta plant pot. At first my father was so startled to see Miss Mackenzie smiling up at him coquettishly and patting the pillow with come-to-bed eyes. He could see she was dressed in very sexy lingerie, as if she was fully intending to seduce him. He was stunned and appalled by this. He stared at her disbelievingly, with eyes on stalks.
Oh, Simon, look at you. I'm so glad to see you. You look so exhausted, so run down. What that woman has put you through, it's too dreadful. Come here, Tiger, she purred. I've been thinking about how desperately lonely you must be. I can make things a whole lot better for you. I thought I'd keep your bed warm for you. Would you like some French champagne? I've got some on ice. I brought it especially for us to enjoy together. What the hell are you doing in my bedroom, Gladys? You need to get out of my house right away. I don't know what you think this is, or what idea is in your head, but I'm not interested in you. I love my wife. Oh, don't be like that, Simon. You're a very good man, you are. You deserve so much better than that wife of yours. I came here today to make you happy. I know how lonely you must be. You don't need to be all defensive with me. I know you've been going through hell, but I will make it better, I promise. She rose out of her bed in her lacy ensemble and trotted over to my father, and before he knew it, she was trying to unbutton his shirt, as she began to stroke him like a cat. This is not appropriate, Miss Mackenzie. I don't know what you think all this is, but we will say no more about this. My children will be returning home soon, and the last thing they need is to see you hanging around the house like this. You've got the wrong idea about me. I'm not looking to have a fun time with another woman. That isn't who I am. Now will you please leave? Oh, don't be like that, Gladys had said. She hadn't been happy to leave at all. It's probably too soon for you, Simon, for a relationship, but I will wait for you. But just so you know, I very much doubt your wife is ever going to come back. I'm quite sure she's left you for good. If you do get lonely, you need your bed warming at night, all you have to do is give me a call, and I'll be over in a shot. Gladys, I'm sorry, but I'm not interested, said my father. My only concern I have at the moment is to find my wife and to bring her home safely. One day as I was seated upstairs in my bedroom at the desk, doing my homework, trying desperately not to think about the whereabouts of my mother or what had become of her, because that just made me feel desperately unsettled. It was late afternoon. For a moment I was tapping my pen, briefly glancing out of the window, and that was when my attention was drawn to a tall, lofty figure standing outside the wood grove. I did a double take. No, I thought,
That just can't be. But I knew my eyes were not deceiving me. I quickly picked up my binoculars to focus on the spot. I observed a male Bigfoot standing outside the fringe of trees. He was looking up in the direction of my bedroom, as if he could see me. So I instinctively leaned out of the window to have a better look at him through my glasses. Was I even seeing right, I wondered? This just can't be. I assure you that when you see something that is so paradoxical, the first thing you do is challenge yourself and argue with yourself about what you're observing. When I leaned out of the window with my binoculars, the Bigfoot's eyes were pinned on me. He began to wave at me, gesturing for me to follow him. That was when I heard a voice in my head saying, "I need to show you something. It's important." Before I knew what I was doing, I had scrambled down the stairs, dashed outside, and was now finding myself following a Bigfoot down the earthen trails through the trees, on what appeared to be a prepossessing but warm day. The only way I can describe to you what was happening to me is that I was locked under some kind of hypnotic trance that the Bigfoot seemed to have placed on me. How he managed to do that I do not know, but I couldn't fight against it, try as I might. I wasn't afraid of this incongruous feeling, as my thoughts didn't appear to be my own. It was like I was a puppet on a string, being controlled by someone else who was governing all my moves and my thoughts. It was as if this Bigfoot had in some way taken full control over me, like a lamb being led to the slaughter, as if my mind had almost been perfectly dusted and polished of any doubts, fears, worries or concerns. It was like a powerful, indomitable force was propelling me ever forwards, so that I was awkwardly stumbling over fallen leaf litter, bracken and broken twigs to keep up with the fast pace of this extremely nimble Bigfoot. I could tell he was old by the discernible streaks of grey in his dark flowing hair. He moved with an enviable grace, as if he was floating. Before I knew it, the Bigfoot had led me straight to Miss Mackenzie's formidable grey-looking house. At first I wondered why he'd brought me here. Let me tell you, close up and personal, the house was extremely ugly and in a bad state of repair. Even though I knew it wasn't right to trespass on Miss Mackenzie's property, the magnetic pull to follow this male Bigfoot was so overwhelming that I just couldn't help myself. The Bigfoot led me to a huge pile of what appeared to be composting leaves. Then he removed some of the leaves away. That was when I observed my mother's white SUV hidden beneath the fertile marsh. The first thought in my head is, what on earth is my mother's car doing on Miss Mackenzie's driveway, clandestinely hidden under all these decaying leaves, so that it just looks like a harmless pile of compost? At this point the Bigfoot was standing what must have been yards away from me. He was watching my every reaction. As I pushed back the curtain of leaves that were covering my mother's car, I stared at the windscreen, and I could see my mother's purse still sitting there on the front seat. In that quintessential moment, I knew something very nefarious was going on. The Bigfoot's eyes seared into mine, and he seemed to communicate with me, for I was locked under his spell. "She's in the house," he said to me, gesturing madly to Miss Mackenzie's house. "She's in there." The Bigfoot then turned around and glided away into the woods, and was gone from my sight, and in that moment the trance that had afflicted me was now broken, and I was free from its grip. I quickly checked to see if I could see Miss Mackenzie's car in the driveway, but she was not there. I was pretty sure her brother Elk was not around either, for Elk spent the vast amount of his time in his workshop carving his curios, which he sold in town. Either that or he was out in nature. I immediately ran to the front door, but discovered it was unfortunately locked. But I was sure Miss Mackenzie must keep a spare key somewhere, and I found one hanging on a rusty nail, obscured by an ugly hanging basket that was filled with dead foliage. I immediately put the key in the lock and opened the door. Miss Mackenzie's house was so dark, all the curtains were drawn, and the furniture in our house was friendlessly austere, and as cold as the woman herself. I hurriedly ambled down the passageway, and when I saw the security door outside one of the bedrooms, I knew instinctively I'd find my mother there. I found the key for the security door hanging on a hook outside the room, so I plunged the key into the lock and turned it. Seconds later I was in the room. My mother was seated on the bed, reading a book, She looked up at me with a startled expression on her face. I guess she couldn't believe she was actually seeing me.
Howard! Is that you? How on earth did you find me?
Before I knew it, we were embracing. But then I quickly urged my mother to get the hell out of the house before Miss Mackenzie got back. I was glad to see she was in excellent shape. She didn't look as if she'd been abused in any way, but she had been locked up for many days. We quickly made our way back home, and when my father saw my mother, they rushed into each other's arms, as if they hadn't seen each other in years. A sea of tears were shed, and there was a rapturous joy in our home, as we were all very happily reunited.
Ashley, what the hell? Said my father. Is it really you? I can't believe it. I can't believe it.
It's me, my mother said.
Where have you been, love? We've been so worried about you.
It's a long story, my mother said, but I'm here now, and that's all that counts.
I thought you'd left me for good,
my father said.
Never, my mother said. I'd never leave you, Simon. Are you crazy? You know how I feel about you and the children. You're all my life.
Looking back at that tumultuous time we went through as a family together, it's hard to reflect over it all, as we were all so emotionally overwrought. But seeing my mother again made everything so much better. My mother's disappearance from our lives, even though it had been brief, made us fully appreciate each other all the more as a family. So out of the bad was birthed so much good. Suffice to say, Miss Mackenzie was charged for abducting my mother and was sentenced to over 5 years in prison. We soon learnt just how depraved the woman actually was, and the lengths she would ultimately go to get my father. She was convinced that in time my father would be beguiled by her charms and fall in love with her. What she intended to do with my mother long term, I do not know, but I prefer not to think about that. As you can imagine, gossip spread around our small town, rather like a swarm of locusts, about how my mother had been abducted by Miss Mackenzie, as the woman had designs over my father. People would say things like,
I knew there was something profoundly odd about that one.
Elk never got into trouble with the police about his part in the abduction, as everybody knew that he'd been controlled by Miss Mackenzie to do her every bidding. I did notice he looked a lot happier these days without his sister around. He continued to make an excellent living for himself, selling curios. My mother also hired him to do work in our yard for us. He told my mother all about his friendship with the hairy man. My mother is the only person Elk would ever confide in. I guess she became like a maternal figure in his life. I'm grateful to the Bigfoot I encountered, and the quintessential part he played in this story, as without his kind intervention, I would have never found the whereabouts of my mother. I do know this, that my father would never have fallen in love with the likes of Miss Mackenzie, whatever that woman may have falsely believed. The very thought of having Miss Mackenzie as a stepmother makes me simply cringe. I do believe the Bigfoot knew that Elk was controlled by the depravity of his weird sister, so he had to think outside the box as how to lead us to our mother. He chose me. I'm eternally grateful for that. So there you are. That's my story. Goodness gracious me, isn't that the most amazing story? I loved every bit of it, and I hope you did too. Until next time, goodbye and good night.